Glympse Bio CEO Caroline Loew grew up in England with the expectation that she could do anything. After all, her grandmother managed a hotel when she was in her 20s, and her parents always supported her ambitions. And while for most students, organic chemistry was just a weed out course for pre med, Caroline actually fell in love with the subject and she pursued her PhD. She then made her career in drug development at Big Pharma, where she built a strong and broad foundation across multiple domains that prepared her well to run a biotech company. In this episode of the Health Biz podcast, Caroline shares her personal and career background and what it's like to lead a high-profile spin-out from MIT with prominent board members and investors. We also talk about sexism in science and business, and I ask her to explain why she appears in so many podcasts. Like a lot of our guests, one of her book recommendations is The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. She's also a fan of General Stanley McChrystal's book, Team of Teams. Some recent recommended reads include Editing Humanity by Kevin Davies and No Rules Rules by Reed Hastings and Aaron Meyer. I'm your host, David Williams, president of Health Business Group. We help companies like Glympse make informed strategic decisions. If your healthcare or life sciences company needs strategy consulting support, please contact me, dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com. Caroline Loew, welcome to the Health Biz podcast. How are you today?
I'm very well. Great to be here, David. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. It's good to see you. And we're going to talk a lot about what you're doing now, but I also want to wind the clock back to childhood. Hopefully it's not a painful memory, but a good memory. And I want to hear about your early life. What was your childhood like? Who were some of your early influences? What was your upbringing like?
Great. So I grew up in England and, had a great childhood. And, maybe my most significant influence was my grandmother. I mean, she was my mother's mother. She's passed away now, but she was a wonderful woman. And, she grew up in, 1920s and 30s. And so like a very, very different time. And she was a great inspiration to me. We were very close. We had an incredible bond. And, I still think about it now. I wish that she could see, what I have achieved in my career, because I was incredibly influenced by what she did. So before she married, she became the manager of what was a famous sort of independent hotel in the south of England. And so there she was, a woman in her 20s managing this hotel. And I think about that now. I mean, goodness, like in the 1930s. I mean, just sort of incredible to me. And she was, intelligent and articulate, and she was composed and thoughtful. And she raised my mother, and my grandfather was away at the war, and later stayed at home as a parent, as many women did of that generation. But later went into politics, like local politics, and was very successful in that, and a great advocate for her community. And that was my real recollection of her. And seeing what she did to, focus on the community and growing the community and building her area, but also, again, as a female in politics in the 70s and 80s. And then this was, of course, the generation of Margaret Thatcher. And so that was sort of starting. It really made an impression on me. And it sort of led me to believe that, I don't think this was conscious at all. And I can sort of fast forward a little bit in my career, but it just led me to believe that anything was possible. And not in a conscious way, but she encouraged me to sort of look at anything and to think about anything. And my parents were also very like that. My father had, taken his own path, and he had funded his own college education. My parents were first generation college educated, and that they had driven that themselves. And so when we eventually, my siblings and I, went to college, we were the first sort of generation that had actually gone to college formally. And, that was a really big deal. And it was sort of this, my parents had really just encouraged us to do whatever, to feel that anything was possible, and
Yeah,
not in a way that was, particularly sort of aggressive or that was driven, but just that there was sort of this openness to thinking that we could do whatever we wanted. And I think about that a lot now with my kids and how I raised them. But it was great and it was freeing, and I did some amazing things. And I think about that not now in the STEM context as well, but later on as I went into my career and I started to encounter what I didn't perceive at all at first as sort of a very male dominated and actually an environment that had a lot of barriers. I didn't realize it. I
right.
candidly didn't realize it because I had just been brought up in this environment where there were no barriers and there was no perception of those barriers and everything was possible. And it sort of really colored my thinking. So it was wonderful. And I attribute a lot to how I think and, and now how I try and encourage others to think and, particularly other women, developing their careers to think.
Yeah, it's a great story, and I think when you have you grow up from a family where it's not sort of conscious and forced down your throat, but you make certain assumptions along the way, and those are built in on the right side. It's great. I think there was a story about Will Rogers, his famous comedian, and his son when he grew up. It took him a long time to realize it wasn't that everybody's father was funny. It's just sort of
Mhm.
something that you grew up with, and I think a lot of girls decide or they hear that well, science or math's not for them, and they sort of just
Mhm.
pick that up in the same way. They just see it and it doesn't occur to them. And it's good when it's the other way around, right? Where you just assume you can do anything. Why
Mhm.
wouldn't you? And then, by the time you build up a head of steam, then you get unstoppable. But I think a lot of
Yeah.
people go off the track because they make an assumption, this isn't for me, that's not for me. And so I think it really is something. And I guess you have to be careful not to do it too consciously with your own, in your own child raising. I know my wife is a school teacher, and she's an electrical engineer by
Yeah.
background, and she teaches math, and a lot of it is to say, math is for girls. It's for everybody.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I want to ask you about organic chemistry now. So because organic chemistry, okay, so to me, what I know about organic chemistry, the way I used to hear about it was that's the weed out class for people who want to be a doctor. I never knew anybody who actually wanted to take it to study organic chemistry. So I got to hear about that one. Maybe it's different in England.
It's not different, and it does have that it does have that connotation for sure. But I grew up, I loved science. I loved the experimentation, and I was just always deeply curious. And actually, I think like many people who go into chemistry, I thought deeply about studying medicine. In England, you decide actually at 18 to either study medicine or to study chemistry or any other discipline. I eventually decided to do chemistry. I went up one of the hardest programs in the country. I loved it's this intensity of the scientific exploration, and it wasn't that I guess I must have been had some capability to get into that program, but I wanted that intensity of scientific exploration. And when you start out, it's a generalist program, right? You're doing all elements of chemistry, organic, inorganic, physical chemistry, um, and they were all very interesting. I loved this complexity of the exploration, and there was just something about organic chemistry that really got me going. And I added an extra year to my program. It was sort of an exploratory program that my university was adding, and I went abroad for a year to what's called a grande école in France. There are these small elite research institutions, and I spent a year doing research, and it was the most thrilling experience I had ever had. I mean, I can't describe it anything like that. It was just, I spent a whole year in a lab doing a research project with a well-known professor in a small field that I was, assigned to. I didn't have a whole lot of choice where I was assigned. But it was just this to really get deeply into research. And, at that point I had been working with a company every summer. I was sponsored by them. I had been doing research in the summer. And at this point I was so hooked. I was like, I can't imagine doing anything else but this kind of research all the time. Like, this is going to be my life. And this passion had been kindled in me. And it was just, it was more about how can I get more deeply into it? How can I do more? And, it was just immersing myself more and more in that universe. You know, I think, I guess I was fortunate. Other people, you have to explore broadly to find things that drive you in this way. For me, I catalyzed that passion early, and I just kept exploring it. And organic chemistry was it for me. I really loved it, and I still love it now. And we joke about it at Glympse. We have a small group of organic chemists,
Yeah.
and we all bond together over our love for organic chemistry.
Yeah. That sounds like a healthy passion. When you got out of school, then how did you think about your career from there?
Yeah, I had planned. I had really planned to go into academia. I was there. I was on this sort of like tenure track trajectory, and I did a postdoc. It was very much that was exactly where I was going, and I became quite disillusioned when I did my postdoc, and it was sort of two different things. Interestingly, the first was I had for my postdoc I had moved from the British system to the US system, and I ended up focusing on a piece of research in my postdoc that was very similar to the research that I had done in my PhD, and I had gone to the group that I was in to specifically not do that. And that frustrated me a bit. And I know why I ended up doing that research. It was because the academic I was working with wanted to solve a specific problem. I had the expertise to do it. It made
Right.
sense. I worked on it. I solved it. It was all good. But for me, there was no intellectual, kind of gain. And so I sort of hit an intellectual barrier. I wasn't growing. That was frustrating. And the second piece was I started to question, and this was then sort of became the hallmark of where the rest of my career went. I sort of started again, I started to question, where is this all going? And where's the application of this? And I became very curious about sort of how the pharmaceutical industry took sort of the output of academia and really turned it into, you know, pharmaceutical products into drugs, and that sort of that conversion and that sort of that confluence of essentially science and business of the clinic. And I started to read deeply about that. I became very interested in that whole business element, and finally decided that that was where I thought I could best use my expertise, not continuing to do this basic research. That was a really important piece of the ecosystem, but that wasn't going to be where I was best skilled. That I felt that I understood this dimension of this intersection, and the intersection was going to be where I was best suited. And so I decided to leave, and I looked for my first role. And interestingly, kind of fueled by this idea that the intersection was important, I went into an area that was not traditional for an organic chemist. So most organic chemists then go and do drug discovery.
Right.
And I thought, well, okay, drug discovery, that's great. But if I really want the intersection, it's not about drug discovery, it's about drug development. I need to go and do drug development. And so I actually went and sought a role in drug development, which was pretty unusual maneuver for someone with my
Yeah.
background. And that then led to the whole career trajectory that I've had subsequently. And, I maybe I had a lot of foresight. I think I had a lot of foresight. I
Yeah.
think that also your career is often, you can only see a few years in advance.
Right.
But there was a very conscious decision to take a step somewhere that was, kind of out of the ordinary, to try and have an impact that I perceived my, skills could. And as it happened, it turned out to really be true. And I think there's always this interesting element of luck in your career choices. You also make your luck too. But in my case, I had a lot of luck in my first career move, and that then cast the die candidly for the rest of my career.
Yeah.
And we can talk about that a little bit, but it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Great. So
And
it sounds like, some very strong influences growing up, and kind of the pathway cleared
Mhm.
that you could do whatever you wanted. You found your love with organic chemistry, some good locations, some some real understanding early on about what path you wanted to be on, and not just sort of drifting along
Mm-hmm.
on the kind of the obvious path that you were doing. Did you have, and you mentioned the role of luck and making your own luck. Did you have any mentors either kind of along the way, or how has mentorship worked for you? Has that been part of your experience?
It has, and I think mentors have changed over time. There have been one or two people who have now I turn to for guidance. Uh, Probably now over like 20-year window, but over time my needs have changed. Right, the kinds of questions that I ask have changed. Many of these people will still be people that I'm in touch with, but yes, absolutely. And I think it's in, I give this advice to people a lot. You need to cultivate those relationships, people who you can turn to. It's generally not just one person, it will be several people. And absolutely, the idea that I don't know everything, and I can't presume to, understand all the kind of aspects and of the decisions and the pathways and the things I should be thinking about. And having someone who has more experience, who has a different worldview, who you can go and ask. And people have diversity of views, because sometimes those views will be conflicting, but at least then you can sort of synthesize them. So absolutely, I found it invaluable. And sometimes those are point views, right? They're people that you know and cultivate relationships with, and you have a few conversations with them, and they help you form some perspective, as you're going through a decision making process. So those mentorships have changed over time, but it absolutely been very important to me and remain very important to me, even in my current role. I mean, maybe more than ever, I would say.
It's interesting. The idea of a mentor is not just kind of an early career thing, but something that actually, as you have more responsibility and more kind of freedom of action and more places you go, a mentor could actually paradoxically become more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So talk a little bit. I want to get to Glympse in a minute, but talk a little bit about the kind of your roles in big pharma. What was that like, and any big takeaways from that experience?
Big pharma is, I think, depending on your viewpoint, people have different connotations, but I found it a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I say to many people who are in big pharma that, like any job, it's sort of what you make of it. But in general, those large companies, are kind of like the companies I was at, Merck and BMS, they have an incredible, pedigree, for want of a better term. They have systems and infrastructure and people within them that has been built over time and is second to none. And if you then take the time as an employee to really integrate yourself into that and to understand it, and understand it not within your domain, but more broadly, and then maybe to move around as well, which is what I did, you can become a broad domain expert and then really grow your skills and expertise and yourself as an individual. And when I give people career advice, I say, you need to build kind of the base of your pyramid and then decide how you're going to kind of grow up and where you want to go to. But a large company really enables you to do that. And so you fast forward, I thought about that very consciously. And in fact, not just consciously, incredibly deliberately. I always wanted to become a CEO of a smaller biotech company. And there were this was my personal opinion, there were a set of domain expertise that I felt were critically important for me to be able to do that job well. And I set about getting those domain expertise in large pharma. Now, you can argue whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do, but I did it in a large pharma company. And I categorically believe that I can do my job the way I can today because of that experience. And I mean, it's a choice, right? You don't have to do it. There are other ways to get that experience. And you see CEOs or people, with roles similar to me who built experience in. There are many diverse ways to do it, but for me, it was a great training ground. And some of the very what's the word? Very sort of core disciplines that I think people tend to dismiss. Understanding financial planning, understanding strategic planning, understanding operations, understanding risk management. There was just understanding how to run audits, understanding how to manage board processes. There are lots of things that a lot of people roll their eyes at, like, that sounds really boring. The
Yeah.
reality is that you need to know how to do all of those things. And if you've seen them done extremely well in a large company and you've been part of managing those processes, and you can then roll them into how you think about managing your own organization, that helps you a heck of a lot. And there are no two ways around it. It's a lot easier to have done it and to be able to repeat it than to learn it on the job first time round.
I think that's great advice. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of ways to get to a role that you have. But the idea of going to these larger places that have actually been successful, have the right processes, show you how to do it in a very professional way. I did something a little bit similar in terms of working at Boston Consulting Group, which is has now gotten a lot bigger
Exactly.
since I was there. But really,
Yeah.
you learn all the elements of the consulting craft. You make good connections with people, and you know kind of what to do. So when you're doing
Mhm.
something on your own and starting your own firm, then it goes in that direction. So I think that's a very good way to think about it. And the career spans a number of years and decades, so it takes some time to learn all of these things and putting that foundation in
Mhm.
place. So now let's turn to Glympse, Glympse Bio, and so maybe first of all, I love the name of the company, by the way, and it has, of course, a GLY instead of a GLI, but Glimpse, and it's like it looked like
Yeah.
a glimpse at Glimpse, but what does the company do, and then why, also why the initial focus that you have in particular disease areas?
Mhm. So we develop, it's a novel technology. We develop real-time activity-based biomarkers. So we have a new technology that can both detect disease and monitor response to disease real time. And this is really exciting because today in diagnostics, there are a couple of things. There are many diseases that we can't detect well. It's very hard to detect response to treatment or to disease evolution. And having a diagnostic that can do that and can do it real time, is sort of activity based, allows us to be able to give clinically actionable information both to patients and to physicians. And the activity is based on proteases. So these are abundant proteins in the body. There are between 570 and 600. And the key is that there are groups of these proteases that are active in pretty much every aspect of human health and disease. And so, sort of the basic way our technology works is we do some basic research. We understand which groups of these proteases are present in or active in a specific disease state. And that activity could be up or down. And then we code for that. And we use these custom biomarker panels to detect that. So simple idea, a little complex in application, right? Of course, as any new technology is. But right now we have this indication in NASH, as you pointed out. So NASH is a fatty liver disease. It affects about 20 million people in the US. In its most severe form, which affects somewhere in the region of about those 3 million of those people, it leads to cirrhosis. So it's a very severe, liver disease that eventually leads to folks needing, unfortunately, liver transplant. It's a very severe condition. And once it starts to progress, it's actually irreversible. And so, it's a real problem. And there are a lot of companies who are developing therapeutics for it right now. And some hopefully will start to come to the market next year. But the hardest thing with NASH is actually there aren't any good diagnostics for it. And today, the standard of care, would you believe, is what's called a liver biopsy. It's a needle.
Doesn't sound good, does it?
It doesn't sound good, and it's not good. And if for many patients, unfortunately, when if they need a diagnosis and they end up having this needle biopsy, it's a painful, uncomfortable treatment. Many patients who have to have it don't end up having it repeated because
It's like a punishment.
it's horribly painful. And first of all, it's hard to repeat frequently. You can't repeat it more than with sort of a year, 18-month interval. But also, it's just so horrible that patients don't want to have it done again. I mean, it's really horrible. And so having a diagnostic like ours, would be a step change in being able to diagnose the disease, and then also, eventually when therapeutics are available, being able to manage treatment. So NASH is a highly protease-mediated disease. There are lots of proteases involved, and so we've been able to code for those, and then we can both diagnose the disease with great fidelity as well as track the treatment. So that's, one sort of our tip of the spear, if you want, our first indication. But you mentioned cancer. Interestingly, the fundamental biological pathway in T cell killing. So when you have cancer killing pathway in your body, T cells are killed, and the fundamental biological pathway there involves granzyme B, and granzyme B is a protease. So we can detect that, and we can then build a diagnostic. So same idea, and the really interesting thing here is that we could, of course, think about a diagnostic that could be used to, detect cancer and so forth. But the more interesting application in this case is, there are many therapeutics out there, including some of the new immunotherapies. The interesting application is to collaborate with drug developers. They have a lot of difficulty understanding in early drug development whether drugs are responding, and it's one of the reasons that the pharma pipelines are actually quite slow at advancing drugs in early development. It's a background that I have, and
Right.
it was a big frustration for us. It's a big frustration for all drug development companies, and so having a diagnostic that can really help with that would be a substantial advance. It would speed therapies forward, which are just much needed in the cancer area. Of course, there's an eventual application for patients who are being treated to understand whether they're responding. But the initial application is in the drug development arena. With hands down, there's just a much real need there for sure.
When we work with startup companies and when I interview executives from earlier kind of mid-stage companies, a lot in healthcare services and in information technology, they learn things from their customers, from their partners, and they do some sort of a pivot. And it's easier to do, I think, in services or with a software product.
Mm-hmm.
But the same kind of pressures could apply, I think, in a company
Mm-hmm.
that's doing a diagnostic or a therapeutic. Have you had those sort of pressures, and have there been any pivots in the company?
Yeah, no pressures for pivot. I think how in general you need to think about any technology is that there is an essential process of evolution, right? The technology is always going to evolve over time. I mean, we have Bob Langer on our board, and Bob has been involved in the founding, I think, of over 220
Yeah.
companies. I mean, just
We'll have to keep it current. We'll have to timestamp the podcast here so it doesn't
exactly.
sound out of date.
I think the last time I asked him, it was 225, and I want to say that was like well over a year ago. So it's probably a lot more than that now. But he has, he's incredibly prolific, and he brings a lot of value to us on our board. And he makes a really interesting observation about this, that there should be a real expectation that that the foundational technology does evolve when it goes into a company. That it shouldn't be static, right? It shouldn't be that n years on you're still using the same generation of a technology or using the technology in the same way. That the process of building it into a company is by definition kind of like a birthing, and then there's a toddler, and then there's a teenager, and so forth, or so there is this natural process of evolution, and so of course our technology is going through that evolution, and I think that happens in any company. Now, some companies may experience something that's a more profound pivot, but in general, this notion of technological evolution, I think, is very common, and it's part of, at least in our space, the process of of scientific discovery and development.
So, you mentioned that you obviously had a long career on the big pharma side, well prepared across a number of different domains. And yet, when you come to Glympse, there's a few things that are different. One, it's obviously a much smaller organization. It's also diagnostics and maybe even devices, compared
Mm-hmm.
with drugs. And then you're also working with a technology that is spun out of a university. And so, what are
Mm-hmm.
some of the unique elements that maybe either you weren't prepared for, or that are that are novel that you really had to address, in your time at Glympse?
Mm-hmm. I'd really thought deeply about this process of coming to run a startup, and so I'm gonna say that I was prepared for everything. But I spent a lot of time back to kind of the mentorship, right? I had talked to a lot of people. I had really thought about it. I had really thought about what my expectations were, but also the expectations were in building a company at the stage that I was taking it over. One of the key differences from any larger company, no matter what its aspiration is, to a smaller company is about speed and focus, right? You're naturally focused in a very small domain and you're going to move much faster. No matter the aspiration of the large company to move fast, you are going to move extremely quickly. And that, in a lot of ways, is the attraction. The ability to move so quickly and to move with such focus. It's a powerful drug in a lot of ways, right? It's a real adrenaline high to be able to do this. You have to be careful not to, first of all, lose focus, but secondly, not to get sucked in by the speed, right? That
Yeah.
you make decisions too quickly. I mean, sometimes we make decisions in an hour on very significant data. We also have to make sure that we have all the right information, we have all the right people in the room, that we're not missing anything, and we put in place enough process to make sure that we're careful about that. I think there's always a risk that you get sucked in by that ability just to do things very quickly, and it sort of leads you off track. In terms of what we're doing, I'm a drug developer by background. You heard that, and so we're a diagnostic company, but we're interestingly what I would call kind of an intersection company. So we sit at the intersection of diagnostics and therapeutics, and that was why I came to Glympse. It was because we're using diagnostics to solve a problem in the world of therapeutics, and it's a problem that spans, drug discovery through drug development, all the way through to how patients are diagnosed and treated. And the diagnostic is very much integrated into that process. And there's sort of this interweaving, if you want, that's very much the world that I came from. And a lot of our development is, while we are developing a diagnostic, a lot of it draws on on therapeutic approaches, and so we're not actually that far removed. And so there was a lot of logic, if you want, to my background. In terms of the question you asked about the sort of the university, I think this is kind of the wonder of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And it's actually incredibly powerful being connected to that ecosystem, right? So our founding technology came from there. We've continued to draw on the evolution of that technology. Our scientific founder, Sangeeta Bhatia, is an observer on a board and still contributes to the company. And and so we have that. We still have all of that available to us. And as our technology continues to evolve, and as her science continues to evolve, we still have access to it. And so there's a lot of power in that intersection, right? And everyone talks about that ecosystem, right? Well, we live that ecosystem,
Right.
and I it's incredibly valuable. There's no doubt about it.
Now, you mentioned one of your board members, Bob Langer, who is maybe
Mm-hmm.
the best known broadly, but you have a lot of impressive and accomplished board members that
Mm-hmm.
are certainly well known and famous within their fields that you work in. I mean, how do
Mm-hmm.
you use a board like that, and what are the challenges?
Mm-hmm. We're wonderfully privileged with our board, and I've been able to draw on my experience at BMS and Merck, where you see how an accomplished board with a breadth of experience can really help guide a company. And how I think about it is, so I've been very conscious in how I've built our board, and I think about our board as part of our team. I mean, it's as simple as that, right? And so, in the same way that I hire people with domain expertise who I want to contribute broadly to the growth of the company, I've brought on our board in exactly the same way. And so, we're fortunate we have a technology that has a lot of potential, and there are very high aspirations for it, and we're realizing those aspirations as we speak. We've been able to bring on a board who share those aspirations and are leaders in their domains, who are now advising us, collectively as a board, but also as individuals, and are able to bring their networks to bear to support us as well. And so we use them in two ways, of course, as a board, but I use them as individuals. I'm able to talk to them. I get their advice individually, but also if there are things that we need to do that in our areas of domain expertise, we ask them to help us. And they willingly collaborate. And we're just, incredibly fortunate to have their networks and their expertise to support us. I mean, it's again, it's another piece of the team, right? In this case, just a superstar team.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, if it were the NBA, you'd have to trade some of these players because you can't have so much talent in one spot. But good. Now, listen, I'm going to ask you an oddball question, and I hope you're not going to be offended by it. But the question is, why do you do so many podcast interviews?
Why do I do so many podcasts?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I didn't know I did so many podcasts.
Fair enough.
But now, I guess now you ask me. I do like the conversation format.
Yeah.
And I like the whole sort of the storytelling thing. I've been really fortunate. I've had a lot of really interesting experiences, and I think this whole, you talked about mentorship. I think there's a dimension to mentorship, which is not just about that I've been able to receive people's mentorship, but I like to mentor back. And I do that a little bit. I have people I mentor, but that's a tiny fraction of what I think I can give back. And so a piece of the podcast is being able to share a little bit back and a little bit more broadly. And particularly kind of the format that you have here, David, is, I can share a bit of my career experience. And for people who, are, thinking about their careers, their career evolution, if that can help, it's a little bit of a way for me to share more broadly. So it's simply about that. I love the conversation. I like the ability to share a little bit more, and to give back in some sense.
Good. Well, that's a good answer. It's a good, straightforward answer to a kind of out of left field question. So much appreciated. So last question, which is one that I do ask everybody, which is just about, what are you reading and anything you would recommend?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of books. One I just finished and one I'm reading. I just read Editing Humanity by Kevin Davis, and I really enjoyed that. He was the founding editor of Nature Genetics. It's the whole CRISPR story, genome editing. It's super well written. I totally recommend it. I'm partway through No Rules by Reed Hastings and Erin Meyer.
Yeah.
And one thing I think a lot about in my company, or in general, I've always thought about this a lot, is the whole notion of culture and how to build culture and what the culture should be and how you sustain that and what the impact is on performance. And, Netflix is sort of the epitome of how culture has driven a specific performance.
Right.
And so this book, Reed actually wrote this book, and it is very interesting. And he wrote it with an organizational psychologist, and it's absolutely fascinating. And Erin studied Netflix for this extended period. It's very, very interesting. I read a lot, but these are two books that I kind of come back to. It's rare that I read a book multiple times, but this is one book that I dip back into again and again, and I've actually marked sections of it. The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz.
I have to tell you, by the way, this is one that's actually been mentioned by at least 3 of my guests, and I actually went and read it as a result. So yes, so go ahead. But that's
so that's a really good book. Yeah. Enough said. And then also Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal. I really like that book, and I read it when it first came out, and just that philosophy. I like you talked about BCG, right? The adaptive team philosophy that that they published, I think, way back 2012, maybe 2011. And there's a lot that's kind of that also McChrystal talks about that's related to that in Team of Teams. And I that was also, I think, a very interesting book as well. So I read a lot of business intersection related books.
No, those sound good, and I was like, I'm adding to my reading list, but luckily that one I've already got that one. I did enjoy it as well, and I think there's a Kanye West quote to start it off. And I showed it to my 18-year-old, and he's like, "Okay, yeah, it sounds like it's worth reading." In any case, Caroline Loew, President and CEO of Glympse Bio, I want to say thank you very much for your time and for your insights today.
My pleasure, David. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Great. You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.